Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm very excited for this video today because I'm going to be talking about my experimental findings. So this will be the first in a series of videos. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, please go and watch my previous video called The Science of Personality Types. There I discuss what my experiments entail. And today I wanted to discuss NE versus SE worldview. So it turns out what I discussed in my previous video about memory and emotional change, those were just the tips of the iceberg. There's so much more. There's so much more that I decided to write a book on it about my findings as well as how to type people the way I do it. So I've actually written a bit of the book already, and today I'm just gonna read an excerpt of what I have so far. So I apologize if I don't make as much eye contact or whatever. I just wanted to read it instead of improvising a presentation because my writing is like 100 times more congruent than my speaking. It will make so much more sense than if I were to just like talk about it. Alright, so here goes. Your extroverted perceiving function affects how you perceive the external world. No duh, right? Extroverted sensing tends to view the world as concrete externalities. The world is what it is, but we can derive personal meaning from it, in I. In contrast, extroverted intuition tends to view the world as possibilities and ideas. The world changes depending on how you conceptualize it. Thus, if you present an NE user with any question, they're more likely to naturally align their worldview with the framework of the question. In contrast, people with extroverted sensing, they tend to be more concerned with the concrete components that exist in the real world, but not exist in the world of the question. So we noticed this dichotomy rather accidentally through several questions within our experiment. Participants were confronted with the trolley problem as well as the prisoner's dilemma. For those who don't know, the trolley problem is a famous ethical dilemma, and our version of it is basically as follows. Suppose you see a train racing towards 5 people who are tied up on a track. You're standing next to a lever that can redirect the train onto a sidetrack, but one person is tied onto the sidetrack. Is it more ethical to pull the lever or do nothing, and why? Would you pull the lever or do nothing, and why? And the prisoner's dilemma is exactly the same. I'll just put a text here because it's not that beneficial for me to read the whole thing. So we split the people into the smooth eye movement group, who is in ESI, and the staccato eye movement group, who is in ISE, based on our definitions regardless of how people perceive themselves to be. So, you know, once again, if you identify yourself as an NI user, say an INTJ, but you had like predominantly a smooth eye movement pattern, I put them in the smooth eye movement group. Okay, so the smooth group readily accepted the hypothetical confines of both of these questions, and they tended to form their reasoning around the central ideas of the question. So for example, they tended to discuss which ethical viewpoint, like utilitarianism, for example, that they hold in order to answer the trolley problem. They seem to see the question first and foremost as an idea being presented. In contrast, the staccato group, they almost always mention certain components that would be present in a real-life situation, but was not present in the question. So they're likely to wonder out loud who the people are who are tied up on the train track, and even how fast the train is moving. So they're hoping to untie people in the event that the train is moving slowly, like one person actually said this. So in the prison scenario, an INFJ even responded that one should never blame the other person because snitches get stitches, was his quote. And that was so interesting because I would never think about, you know, the real components of this question, and he is right. If this was a real situation that you find yourself in, you probably don't want to snitch. So they seem to see the question first and foremost as a collection of tangible moving parts. There is also a tendency for the smooth group to mention multiple perspectives before mentioning their own perspective. It's as if they're playing around with the different possible ways to conceptualize a question before committing to their own one conceptualization. So in this sense, their reality being illustrated by what they perceive to be the best option, their reality changes as their conceptualization changes. So they're interacting with the world via N, hence NE. In contrast, the staccato group, the SE group, they tend to solely mention their own perspective, though the option they choose often depends on those unmentioned concrete components that I mentioned. So for example, one person said that they would pull the lever if all the people were strangers, but they wouldn't pull the lever if that one person that was tied onto the sidetrack was their friend or family. So in this sense, their reality depends on the tangible world from which they're able to extract abstract and personal conclusions in I. So your extroverted perceiving functions also affect how you interact with external information, and thus, in a sense, shape the world around you. As discussed previously, the reality of extrovert sensing depends on concrete externalities, even if you're a high NI user, and the reality of extroverted intuition depends on possible conceptualizations, even if you're a high SI user. So if you present an NE user with a brainstorming question, they'll see every answer that they think up as a new and viable reality. So it's real and existing because they've thought of it. Whereas the SE user, they handle brainstorming questions a little differently. So they tend to see tangible limitations and correct their answers to be more aligned with concrete reality. So just because they've thought of it doesn't make it a viable answer to a brainstorming question. This dichotomy was revealed through two parts in our experiment. During one part, we asked the participants to list 5 colors that begin with the letter A. So this was originally meant to measure creativity and sensory recall. I hypothesized that the smooth group would have an easier time recalling the names of colors with introverted sensing and creating new color names like Arctic Frost with an E. But this turned out not to be true. So the question ended up being difficult for everyone. Some people listed more colors and some people listed less colors, but there was no significant correlation between the amount of colors listed and the eye movement type. If anything, this was an interesting find. If anything, women were slightly more likely than men to list more colors. But despite the inconclusivity of that aspect, we did notice something very unexpected yet intriguing. So although both groups listed colors like apple red, the staccato group was far more likely to write off such colors as not a real color. So they would say, apple red, oh no, that doesn't count. Let me try to think of something that actually counts. So perhaps because apple red physically looks the same as red, plain old red, SE doesn't see it as a separate color. Interestingly, one person listed apricot and wondered aloud if it counts. She then decided that it probably counts because apricot is likely to be one of the many Crayola colors in her words. So she needed something tangible to exist in external reality, like a Crayola crayon that's named apricot, for it to count as real and thus legitimate. So once again, this demonstrates that the SE experience of reality is intrinsically tied to concrete externalities. So in contrast, the smooth group, the NE group, showed no such inclination. So they freely listed colors like anticipant red and almost never wondered if it's legitimate, at least not out loud. It's as if a new color is created simply through them conceptualizing it as such. Like, I'm pretty sure there's not even an HTML color that's called anticipant red, but because they've thought of it and they've linked, the color red with the feeling of anticipating, it counts as a new color to them. So this demonstrates that the NE experience of reality is dynamic and malleable. Since SE is dependent on concrete reality, it tends to change reality through changing or repurposing or manipulating tangible external objects. So NE is more dependent on its conceptualization of reality, and thus they tend to change reality by shifting their own conceptualizations. So this dichotomy was revealed when we asked the participants to list 5 uses for a pen. So I hypothesized that the staccato group will list more physical uses, while the smooth group will list more past uses, as well as more off-the-wall uses, or like creative or bizarre uses. And this turned out to be true. So back then I didn't even know what an off-the-wall use would entail. So that was kind of like subjective, right? So I was like, I don't know what I would categorize as practical and what I would categorize as off the wall, but after gathering more and more information, it became pretty clear. So it's basically almost any use that's neither physical nor practical, and I will get into examples later. So the staccato group mentioned uses like writing, drawing, poking, fiddling, like a fidget spinner, throwing, like throwing it at someone, tying up your hair, and using it as a straw, like to drink water. So while some of these uses were also mentioned by the smooth group, the smooth group was far more likely to list past and creative uses, whereas, the staccato group pretty much stayed within these types of physical and practical uses. So as predicted, people with higher SI, which were defined as people with both the smooth eye movement and rigid or judging body language, so they would be the SJs, they were more likely to list past uses. This can be how they've actually used a pen in the past, like using the tip to press a tiny button, or how they've seen others use it, like whether that's in real life or in a movie, for example, as an emergency breathing tube, like stick it into their trachea, I don't know what it's called. Also, as predicted, the people with higher NE, defined as, smooth eye movement plus fluid or perceiving body language, they were more likely to list off-the-wall uses, like use it as eccentric decoration, a prop for a magic trick, put it in a collection, or put it in a museum. So amazingly, an ISFJ even said pig pin, like for housing pigs, since no one specified a pen as a writing instrument specifically. So this wasn't only a brainstorming exercise, as it turned out, but a revelation in how people interact with the world. So one striking observation was that the smooth group often made multiple uses out of roughly the same physical action by conceptualizing it differently. So for example, an ESFJ, she listed writing and informing as two separate uses. She also listed drawing and shading as two separate uses. Meanwhile, some people in the staccato group actually even wonder if writing and drawing counts as only one use. So they would say, writing, drawing, wait, that's kind of the same as writing, so they're back at, one use, some of them. So SE users influence reality in the midst of it. So they see the act of using something as requiring them to physically exert upon the object, which makes sense if you have SE, whether you are, high NI or high SE. Thus, poking or stabbing someone is probably the same use, but poking and throwing are clearly different uses, whereas the difference between writing and drawing is more gray. So presumably writing and informing would count as only one use to the SE user. So interestingly, each physical use seems to naturally lead to a sensical purpose. So I think that's how SE leads naturally to NI. So for example, using the pen as a straw would be for the purpose of drinking something, and throwing the pen would be for the purpose of throwing it at someone, like hitting someone. So in contrast, each physical use seems to lead to multiple random purposes for the NE user, so for the smooth group. For example, if the pen was physically doing nothing notable except for maybe existing, the NE user tends to superimpose purposes upon it, like for the sake of decoration, for the sake of a collection, or for being in a museum. Instead of each physical action counting as one use, each purpose counts as one use. Perhaps the clearest example of this was when an NE user, someone in the smooth group, said filling a pen holder as a purpose. Okay, this kind of blew my mind, you guys, because the purpose of a pen holder is to hold a pen, obvious. But if we accept that, it can also be argued that a pen's purpose is to give purpose to a pen holder. So NE users influence reality by looking at it in a different way. They see the use of something as the different purposes one can superimpose upon it. Thus, writing and informing would count as two different purposes. It appears that NE users, they tend to prioritize the intangible, like a purpose, as objective, and therefore an appropriate answer to a skill testing question. I think we can all agree that a purpose is something intangible. In contrast, SE users tend to prioritize the tangible, like a physical action, as objective, and therefore an appropriate answer to the same skill testing question. So I think we can agree that a physical action is tangible. Alright, that is the end of that excerpt. I hope you enjoyed. Alright, so about my experiments, I realize I'm not part of the scientific community and I don't have a PhD or whatever, but I think it's nice for someone like me to start doing this stuff. I don't think that anything I do will be like conclusive evidence. Also, lack of resources, but I do really want to present everything that I find. Before, I didn't want to actually say my questions because I didn't want to influence people, but now I feel like I have enough samples to draw conclusions and I can probably move on to like a slight variation of the questions, so it doesn't really matter that I'm like telling you guys the question, but also I want to tell you guys the questions so that you can do these experiments if you want for yourself. And what's really exciting update time, is that after I did my Science with Personality Types video, a lot of people approached me. It looks like I can share this findings and have other people do it. So a lot of people are more impressive than me, like they're studying psychology or they're studying neuroscience. Yeah, I'm so excited that people are reaching out to me, and some people say that I should check my information with Dave's superpowers and stuff. And yeah, I want to do that. Like, my dream, ideally, I think everyone should be using the same typing system. But people just keep adding to it to make it more and more nuanced and accurate. It's like, okay, everyone is using the same system to determine the judging axis, but like a few years later, someone determines how to do the perceiving axis, and it just gets bigger and bigger rather than fighting and bickering about whose thing is more accurate. So yeah, if they're open to it, I would love to do that. Kind of type messaged me, so now we're checking where we agree and where we differ and trying to figure out why. So I think this is very exciting. Yeah, I want to make typing accurately accessible, so that's why I'm writing the book, which should be affordable for everyone. As always, thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye! What's really amazing to me about these things is that they're basically in the names of the functions. Like, of course, NE being NE would be more objective when it comes to intuition, and NI would be more subjective, whereas SE would be more objective when it comes to the sensory and tangible, whereas SI would be more subjective when it comes to the sensory. And it's kind of confusing, right? Because you think of S in general as more objective and external, and maybe people tend to think of in general, like NI and NE, as more abstract and more subjective. But more and more I find that the bigger difference lies in your perceiving axis, not whether you're a sensor or an intuitive. I mean, that intuitively makes sense also, because otherwise, why would we need an I and an E? Why can't people just be either intuitive or sensing? Why does it have to be, are you an I user or an E user? Yeah, like, of course there's going to be massive differences in the perceiving axis. And if you have an I, you also have SE, so it makes sense that the difference between high NI and high SE users aren't going to be as dramatic, because both people have both functions. And of course, as you get older, your lower function increases. So an older INFJ, they might as well have like strong SE, and a lot of them do have strong SE.